Okay, so Plato's Republic is a work of the 4th century BC, Greece. His work is famous for Plato's discussion of justice, of the timeless forms, or ideas, and philosopher kings. My intention today is to focus primarily on Plato's defense of an ethical theory of justice against the character Thrasymachus, and the philosophical and political work Plato finds himself getting into to defend such a theory. I argue that to study the Republic solely in terms of either its political or its philosophical, one or the other, lessons, is not really to see the whole picture. You really have to get Plato both as a political philosopher and a philosopher, right? Politics and philosophy. In fact, I go as far as to say that wherever philosophy is, there is politics as well, and vice versa. Nowhere is this more true than on the pages of the Republic, where the whole venture into philosophy, his whole exploration of metaphysics and epistemology, is launched by a crisis of political legitimacy, right? How should we rule? Who should rule? And what is rightful power? This symmetry, in fact, was once taken up by this class because you used to have 2 lectures, 2 CVSP 201 and 205 lectures on Plato. They're now 1, but luckily here I am. I'm going to give you both in one. So you're going to get 2 lectures in one. You're going to get politics, ethics and politics on one side, and a good dose of philosophy on the other. So before I jump into the dialogue itself, it is important to set the context of the debate. On the one hand, we have the sophists, who argue, like the rebellious Thrasymachus, that there is no truth except what we humans make, and that democracy allows each to express their own truth. They were Democrats, they were relativists, they believed in the common man and woman. On the other hand are those like Plato who argued for a permanent realm of ideas, providing a standard of truth anywhere and at any time, which can only be understood by the philosophical elite, by a philosophical ruler, right? So anti-democratic. With this, we have introduced the 2 camps of the sophists and the Platonics, and we may begin our descent into the dialogue. At the end of the day, we can look at the Republic as a whole, as a theory of an ideal community or polis, right? A political entity, a city, based on a version of justice, and we may judge its worth, its performance from this point of view, right? Plato's spokesman in the dialogue, Socrates, who was actually his real-life teacher, as we will see, died at the hands of the city and came to have a great influence. His death, his execution by certain citizens inside of the city of Athens, had a great influence on Plato, and we'll see that in the text. And I'll return to the issue of the real-life relationship between Socrates, the father figure, and Plato, his student. It is Thrasymachus' challenge in Book 1, which largely sets the stage for the Republic. Thrasymachus argues that justice is nothing else than the interest of the stronger, of those who rule, and that might makes right. That justice is a lie, a falsehood, or a myth to justify power as it is found in the political world. There is no justice. It is a story, a fairy tale of the powerful for those weak to accept and embrace so that the powerful may rule more easily. Thrasymachus' position is rejected by Plato's Socrates, who argues that rulership should never take the interest of the ruler as primary. By definition, rulers shouldn't rule for themselves, but for those citizens. Despite his refutation of Thrasymachus' position, Socrates has yet to provide a definition of what justice actually is, and sets out to find one, and this is early on in Book 1. So with the end of Book 1, Socrates and his discussants, Glaucon and Adeimantus, agree to take up the search. They agree to search for justice at the larger level of the state later, but first to start at the smaller level of the individual, the psychology of the individual citizen. They say if they can find it there, it'll be much easier to find it later on in the city at large. This deductive procedure seeks the individual through the lens of the larger body politic, and is oriented to viewing the individual part specifically as part of the whole, right? Plato is famous for putting the whole first. Socrates moves towards an understanding of justice, considered aside from its rewards, with a view to the essential good and evil which justice and injustice bring to those who exercise them. Thus, Socrates and his friends set out to show that justice is not only best for the happiness it brings, but also best in and of itself, regardless of its consequences. And this begins their inquiry into the ideal form of the state. Socrates starts his theory of the state by laying out the economic organization that is necessary for its existence. He lays out what he calls the basic divisions of labor, which he holds to be the conditions necessary to allow a city to develop and flourish. Merchants, workers, and buyers all interact to provide a variety of goods necessary for life. They create things, they make products. Each type of labor must be performed by those who are best fit to do the job, such that the division of labor most efficiently utilizes the natural abilities of the citizens. Right? So remember, we're in a theoretical city at this point. This is all a hypothetical city, not an actual city. As the city's needs and wants expand into a city of unlimited desires, the city of pigs, as Glaucon calls it, there will be a demand for an expansion of land in order to provide for growing wants and needs. With this, Socrates informs the group that they have discovered war to be derived from the causes which are also the causes of almost all the problems of the state. From these beginnings of the search for justice in the state, the harmonization of differences and the suppression of conflict, we can see, are taken as constitutional principles of political order. Here then, unity, not diversity, appears to be Plato's primary concern, right? He's a peace and order philosopher. To the ends of the state's economic and territorial expansion, the city of pigs, a place of military training will be necessary, and the division of labor is again applied so that those who are most fit will fill out the army. Socrates turns to the analogy of the courage of dogs, thumos, spirit, right? And dogs epitomizing spirit and courage in order to imagine a class of soldiers who will prove dangerous to enemies but soft and welcoming to fellow citizens. The most fitting education for the soldiers, Socrates finds in music and gymnastics. A strong program of censorship is set up in order to encourage some themes and repress others. All harmful examples of passion, irrationality, or cowardice from the Greek poets and myths were to be eliminated from the education of the youth, who will need to be strong defenders of the polis. The state should produce myths and rulers and censor and lie for the public good. Right? Sounds a little bit like Leo Strauss. Right? 2,000 years later, of course, Strauss is Platonic. Plato now pushes the dialogue onward to ask the primary political question: who shall rule? Right? My political theory professor always said this is the central question of political studies: who should rule? He begins his search, Socrates, for the best rulers, in holding that the best amongst the old must rule the young. The elite should be for the common people, but not of them. At this point, Plato fashions his political myth of the earth-born castes, his famous myth of the metals. Here, the young must be taught that their training and early education were experienced in the earth, in the Greek soil, which has given them a specific nature: gold, silver, or bronze. Yeah, it's a little bit cold in here. I'm a little sick. Thank you. Right? The myth of the metals. The Greek soil, right? That all citizens were born of the Greek soil from which they were born as their true mother, and must be loved and defended from enemies. Right? This is the myth of the citizens, to inspire loyalty and fidelity to the homeland. This identification with a class of metals dictates a citizen's rank in society, their political status, and ultimately their social destiny. The purity of these classes, these castes, this caste system, is to be guarded for Plato, as there is nothing which they should be so carefully guarded, he says, as the purity of the race. Right? Each of those groups, the gold, silver, and bronze, moving downwards, must not intermarry unless justified to do so. The highest ranks of the guardians find their purpose in the protection of the Constitution, which takes as its primary purpose not the disproportionate happiness of any one class, but the greatest happiness of the whole. Okay. At this point in his development, Plato is working up the basics of his state from its very foundations. And starting at the level of appetite, hunger, desire, right, the city of pigs again, with material production and consumption, Plato addressed his city first and foremost at its lowest levels. Right? That is, he worked toward the ideal of justice from the lowest levels of material exchange and human appetite. For him, the lowest levels of human experience, the body in essence. Now, with the education and the role of the warrior class in development, he's moved upwards from appetite and desire of the working classes to the passions and emotions of the warring class. In contemplating his four highest virtues, courage, wisdom, justice, and temperance, we'll get to these, Socrates declares justice to have been discovered in the division of the state itself. That is, justice here is seen in the differentiation of the city into its various specialized tasks, workers, guardians, and rulers, where justice is each part doing what it does well and not mixing into or interfering with the other parts. In terms of class functioning, this means the laboring class obeying, the brave warriors defending, and the wise rulers wise guardians ruling. Each of these in harmony with the other, right? Creating the overall good and harmony of the whole. And this is Plato's development, right? He's not concerned about the parts. It's about creating this total unity, right? Having found justice in the state, Socrates now returns to the question of justice in the individual. Right? I got it wrong at the beginning. He starts with the state and then he goes to the individual. Right? So what is a just person? What is a just action? And is this the happy way to live? To begin, Socrates moves to articulate the structures of the soul, the psyche, right? The structures of the self that make up a person. The three classes found in the state before have an equivalence at the level of the soul and are translated into appetites, emotions, and intellect. In short, the animal, emotional, and intellectual. And guess where rulership is going to be, right? As the just state goes, so goes the individual. It will not cheat, nor lie, nor steal, so long as each part functions to carry out its own business, unimpeded and in harmony with its counterparts. It is only with the meddlesomeness, right, and interference of the inferior in the rising up of a part of the soul against the whole that the soul is rendered into corruption and deformity. We'll make sense of this. That is, justice in the soul as in the state means that each part does its own business, whether in ruling or being ruled. Right? With this, Socrates declares with that Thrasymachus' equation, right? His equation of injustice with domination and strength and happiness, right, in the individual has been defeated, as it serves no one to be miserable and sickly either of body and soul. The soul of just person must find harmony within itself. And if any part is out of place, as in Thrasymachus' idea, where a certain part rules over another, right, out of harmony, you have imbalance, and happiness becomes impossible, and misery the necessity, right, necessary. In response to his colleagues' requests, Glaucon and Adeimantus, the group now return to the question of the state. They've discovered happiness in the just soul, and they want to return to the question of politics. Right? The book's taking a turn here. Declaring the issue of class conflict in their city resolved, as each part of the polis has accepted its rank and function in the greater picture, Socrates restates his confidence in the overall harmonization of the classes and its citizens, where all are of one opinion about what is near and dear to them. They all tend towards a common good. With this, Glaucon moves to ask how Socrates has actually made the case that their ideal state is possible, given history and human nature as they and we now know them, right? This is where Plato's idealism in the hypothetical state, right, is being challenged with real-world practice. We've never seen such a thing. We don't see such good, just people. How can we make this city happen? With this, the quintessential Platonic moment of the dialogue has arrived. Here we begin to think about the interaction of the timeless universal ideals of the good and justice on the one side with the historical form of justice, the state, right, on the other. That is, how do we make compatible the ideal and the real? With so much of the life and ordering of the polis family described, some of which I've left out, in terms of the common holding of wives, the communism of property, and the organization of mating, right? He was very totalitarian in his intervention into the private life and choice. There is no private life. What has arrived is consideration of the viability of the ideal state. And this is really Plato's big contribution here. What's about to come. Does such an ideal state, as an ideal, make it a historical impossibility? Does a conflict between Plato's ideal and real run through time so as to make his ideal city foolish, as many have and continue to claim? We only have to think about Machiavelli as kind of arch-realist meant to say that Plato's relationships and goals simply can't exist. We don't bring people up to the city, we must bring the city down to human nature. Right? To what universal and timeless map can reason refer in order to plot the good political course through history that Plato aspires to? How do we make this happen? It is the metaphysical question of the conceptual foundations of justice for the polis which Plato now has to address. The interplay of the real and the ideal, Socrates declares as the third wave and the greatest and heaviest, is now what's taken up in the dialogue. Right? This is Plato's progress. History is clearly in rebellion against the realization of Plato's idealistic words and dreams. Nevertheless, he claims through Socrates that just because such a state has never existed does not mean that it is not ideal, and if it is ideal, it clearly ought to be possible. Conditional upon this revolutionary political transformation being brought about, Plato places one of his most famous claims on Socrates' lips. Until philosophers are kings and political greatness and wisdom meet in one, cities will never have rest from their evils. Right? I wonder if citizens of Beirut brought this to their politicians, how they might respond to such a claim. With this bold statement, Plato makes the philosophical conditions for his political program clear. It is the disclosure of the ideal through the philosopher's political authorship, with which Plato seeks to establish true political authority and to make it concrete in the political world. Plato here sounds his endorsement of the rule of a philosopher class over those commoner natures, those more common people who are destined to be ruled, right? A two-tier, multi-tier system of political rulership, right? Against the real world politicians and sophists, we talked about the sophists at the beginning, the Democrats, who think only of reputation, persuasion, and wealth, right? They're corrupt from Plato's point of view. Plato presents us with a philosopher who keeps his gaze upon the permanent realm of ideals and is interested only in truth, right? It's not about worldly gain. It's not about domination. It's not about ambition, right? The Romans love that word so much. The rule of the universal idea for Plato is made the model for the correct ordering of the polis. As such, the rule of these philosophical few, these philosopher kings, requires Plato to dive into a philosophical defense of truth and its basis in the perfect ideas which he called the forms. This is where things get complex. Though the terms of the theory of the forms are in play here, the outlines of such a theory remain wholly beyond the bounds of the text thus far. We don't really know what these ideal forms are, right, or where they can be found until this point. This stage of the dialogue reveals a dramatic ascension, an elevation, from the allegorical language of appearances towards Plato's language of the science of dialectic. We've arrived at the doorstep of the royal road to truth, right? From the world of the senses to the more real world of the mind and reason. Such a progression in the text mirrors the liberation of the mind, which is witnessed in the upcoming allegory of the cave. The moment has arrived to describe the true nature of philosophical practice in terms of its innermost idea and content. A second education for the philosophers is now begun by Plato, right, based on his central metaphysical scheme or theory of reality in the Republic, the doctrine of the ideal forms. The ultimate unity of the system of ideas or forms, as will be explained, as will be examined, becomes the essence and ruling principle of the polis, political architecture, and ultimately his pedagogical system. Yet, as Adamantus, his interlocutor, his debater, brings out at this point, the problem remains as to how the ideal itself, right, may be made to replace the corrupt Athenian reality and the poverty of democracy for which Plato has become such a famous witness. That is, how can we come to know and realize the ideal when there is so much resistance to it in the real world of corruption, common sense, hedonism, and political practice, right? How do we replace everything we know up to this point with a revolution, right? Not in political economy with Marx, but a revolution in political reasoning with Plato. To answer this, Plato turns to develop a theory of knowledge and ideas in order to establish the philosophical method that his philosopher kings, his guardians, can use to rule. First, through access to universal ideas, and then by translating them into political practice. So here we get the ascension of knowledge for Plato, and this is his basis of the development of the intellect. But let me go through that. The knowledge of the highest idea at the top is grounded on the ultimate idea earlier discussed, the good. From this highest point of reference, thinking may once again descend to the lower levels of experience to bring order to the diversity of phenomena registered by the senses. Right? The mind must organize for us what we see, what we experience with the senses, in order to make sense out of the apparent confusion and chaos of sensory experience, right? Which for Plato is associated with the demos, the people, right? They only think with their senses and through their sensory experience. They are not able to bring reason to the senses. From this highest point of reference, thinking may once again descend, right? Okay, I've said that. This hierarchy of understanding is built up on the four levels to which Plato assigns four mental faculties, which descend in the following order: reason, right? The pure level of pure ideas, the good being example. Intellect is mathematics, where numbers and shapes are understood, right? Belief at a yet lower level, at the level of raw sensory experience, where objects of perception are involved, and finally at the very lowest level, imagination, as the absolute lowest form of intelligence, right? Thus, the highest level of knowing is understood with the mind alone. The senses must be shut off. And at the lowest, we are in the realm of imagination, not quite the world of the senses, but rather memory and mental imagery, which are leftover of the senses. But that level of picture thinking, a term that Hegel would use, is a complete immersion of intelligence in the senses and an inability to really understand what they mean, to sort them out, and to make sense of the world, right? And the way the world ought to be. Okay. If the line then divides true knowledge at the highest level from false opinion at the lowest, then the implications of application wait for the realm of politics and the question of justice. Socrates speaks of a progress of consciousness through which philosophical understanding, right, makes this journey from the lowest levels to the highest, right, such that it may take a foothold, right, in the real world and begin the work of bringing the heavenly ideal of justice and the good at the highest level down to the world of the senses, the empirical, right? Thus, the famous allegory of the cave is set off and initiated to describe the actual ideological, political, and social conditions within which human consciousness is held captive, right? The citizens are unable to see these higher truths because we're stuck in a cave, right? And diverted from truth and ultimately corrupted. The divided line then provides Plato with a ladder to imagine the liberation of the captives of the cave, the citizens of Athens at the time, to the light of truth, from the lowest levels of imagination to the highest levels of reason, right? It's borrowed text, I'm not the artist. In Plato's cave, in society as he then saw it, humans unknowingly carry out underground lives in a deep, dark cave. Their arms and heads are bound, as we see the people, the prisoners at the front, and their gazes are fixed upon a wall upon which the shadows of real objects are cast. A group of presenters create these shadows by manipulating objects and puppets between a bright fire and the wall of the cave where shadows fall. For the audience, the shadows cast on the wall are taken as reality, as truth. Voices are projected into the cinema, in association with the shadow images and are taken as coming from the shadow objects themselves. This social and sensory indoctrination, right, is an analogy for the world of nurture, right, and would be best represented then and now by education, law, art, media, tradition, and other social and political institutions which seek to form, to inculcate within us certain customs, beliefs, and worldviews, and ultimately ideology, right, political beliefs. Even when released from this captivity, right, this captivity, prisoners refuse to give up the lessons of their previous prison. Should these same captives, these citizens of Athens, be finally dragged out of the cave, up to the light, right, they would be blinded and go mad. For those who escape the limits of the cave, the philosophers who initiate the training of philosophy, their new point of reference will take some time to adjust to and finally embrace, and that's the sun, which I think you can make out somewhere. Is the sun visible on this image? I can't see from my angle. But the sun is the highest good, the highest idea, and a fixed point of reference for the philosopher. Slowly, philosophers will come to see the light of day, the truth of being, without discomfort. Being what is, right? What is real. Once having come to see the sunshine of highest truth, the idea of the good, they naturally come to understand its primacy as a compass for human judgment, philosophical as well as political, right? Having come to this startling escape, the newly liberated person and become philosopher now sets their sight upon returning to the cave to rescue their former fellows, right? Neo has to save the world. It's not enough for him to see the matrix. He now has to return to it, right? And offer emancipation and liberation to its people. Such a return to the cave, Plato warns, would be laughed at as ridiculous and denounced as heretical by virtue of the philosopher's challenge to the customs and traditions of the polis, its prejudices. Such a mission makes clear would likely end in the philosopher's death, who would be treated as a revolutionary enemy of the state, threatening the status quo. To borrow a term from contemporary use, they would be considered terrorists, right? Clearly, Plato had not forgotten the lesser lessons of his teacher's plight, his destiny, who was sentenced to death for his heterodox, unconventional teachings. And this is Socrates, the very teacher, right, of Plato and his advocate in the Republic itself. In Plato's ideal city, then, the statesman requires, the leader requires this ultimate knowledge of the idea of the good in order to be capable of rational political judgment. In having found eternal truth in the final idea of the good, the very highest point of the line, and outside the cave of the city and institutional social experience, right? The philosopher returns to the cave of the polis with the blueprint for its reform and ultimate perfection. Here the philosopher must rule as a king, and as the only one who has exclusively received the highest education above mathematics, and that's in dialectic, in pure reasoning. In this way, Plato delivers his justification as to how one who has been trained to the philosopher class must now be persuaded to give up their comfortable, meditative, philosophical life and return to the messiness of the cave, the city, to correct it. With this, the true guardians have been found, and Plato considers his case for the practicality, right, the real-world viability of his state, of his ideal city, complete. Okay. In conclusion, a few comments. I've really done this quickly. Okay, a few comments and concerns. Where Thrasymachus started out arguing that rulership is the art of exploiting the ruled, Plato turned this position around to its opposition so that rulers themselves are committed to the rule of the forms, the good, as an ultimate authority. In this sense, the philosopher is for Plato as much a political agent as a prophet, conducting the sight of the community up to the light of the sun of ideas through the practice of philosophy and reasoning, which he termed dialectic. The absence of the philosophical rule and the heavenly city of their ideal forms in the real world of history and experience is thus purgatory, a kind of permanent purgatorial condition. Without it, we will never make progress, and we will always be stuck in cyclic recurrence and reproduction of inequality, injustice, and violence. This condition witnesses the tragic alienation of humanity, right, this absence of philosophy, from its own essential spiritual and political potentials. We must admit, though, critically, that Plato's Platonic justice, as we see it completed here, is not attained through the willing agency or volition or consent of its citizens. Rather, it is found at the level of the organization of the polis as a whole, which is really the only person, right, is the totality. Maybe Aristotle says the philosopher kings are also somehow men, human beings, but Aristotle says that Plato's citizens are actually animals, right? The realization of the ideal polis is not achieved through an education which takes the individual potentialities of its citizens as ends in themselves, right? From this angle, the citizen seems to exist for the city rather than the other way around, right? The idea of liberal arts education are off the table here. In this rule of the one of justice, the state, the harmony, the unified totality of the state, over the many of freedom, its citizens, Plato set his city against what he saw as the ugly and inevitable consequences of democratic pluralism, right? Strife, civil war, and conflict. And this was the condition of the times up to and well after Plato's time on Earth. Despite this critical note, Plato's concern was first and foremost with the frequency of strife and conflict in the Greece of his day, as I said. If we are going to try to understand Plato, there is little value in critically dismissing his political thought in favor of our liberal and democratic standards in exchange for his. Nonetheless, it is difficult not to see strong class prejudice in Plato's political order, as is often expressed explicitly in a distaste for manual labor, for work, in what he called the banausic. Those who work with their hands should never rule. They are somehow lowly and unwashed. Manual labor, after all, made one unfit for education and leadership for Plato. To bring this all together, right, the structure and design of the Republic may be seen as a reflection of the revolutionary implications of the allegory of the cave and the hierarchy of knowledge illustrated in the doctrine of the line. These are somehow core to understanding the whole progress, the ascent of the dialogue. The movement of the dialogue from the conventional and low sphere of the senses to that of the ideal permanence of ideas reveals a teaching philosophy, right, and a philosophical strategy at work behind the dialogue. Plato slowly refocuses our eyes from the historical level of custom and convention to the ideal horizons of reason and philosophy, from the earthly to the heavenly. And of course, this is a framework, earthly and heavenly, that would last well into the Middle Ages with Platonism and Aristotelianism. The overall buildup from the convention to ideal is a reflection of the movement of the soul, from the appetites to the passions with perfection finally attained in the reasoning of the philosophical class who, right, represents, and this whole development represents the unity of the three castes inside the polis itself. With the myth of the metals behind him, right, gold, silver, and bronze, Plato's protagonist, Socrates, then tackles the greatest challenge to his theory of just state. What is the ideal ground and form of legitimate authority that only the mind can know and which has never been historically seen? It is not until this moment that the philosopher has played any substantial role in the construction of the city. Only with philosophical training does the mind arrive at the conflict between the senses and the mind, right? We must see that they're not the same thing, right? That there is a tree of the mind and one of the senses, and they must be reconciled, right? Right? The conflict between the senses and the mind so as to be capable of gaining perspective needed to witness the ideal forms which order the world as a whole. This evolution Plato took as a model for the foundation of an elite philosophical education, which raises the mind from its captivity in the many impressions of the senses, right? And by extension, to ultimately emancipate the polis as a whole from the wants, interests, and opinions, right? Many opinions. Philosophers' reasoning will only have one opinion, right? Because reason shows that truth. But reason emancipates the city from the wants, interests, and opinions of its many members, which plague it with internal conflict, and that sounds like democracy from Plato's point of view. Where Plato sought to bring the heavenly forms down to earth, philosophical and political legitimacy are intertwined. He did this in order to bring an end to chaos and the shifting sands of public opinion and sensory perception, where appearances tyrannize over truth, right, and desire over the mind. Plato's grand narrative of the state, then, is first and foremost a project where political problems are subjected to the remedying logic of philosophical resolution. The two are inseparable for a truly Platonic understanding of the Republic, right? Right? We can't get real politics in the real world unless we reach up to, through reason and philosophy, to find truth and then return. The cave dwellers to which he addressed himself were his fellow Athenians and Greeks, and the Republic itself becomes the educational exercise of the philosopher who has returned to the cave to free his countrymen and women by philosophical means. Plato, then, here is the philosopher who escaped the cave and who makes his return through the writing and circulation of the dialogue itself. Right? There's a recursive level. Right? What Plato is doing is what the philosopher does inside the Republic. On my reading, Plato, the author of the Republic, is also the selfsame heroic philosopher in the Republic. We know that Plato made similar attempts to philosophically convert kings in Sicily to his political ideas. These attempts were unsuccessful, and at least on one occasion, Plato was almost put to death. He actually ran away twice. The Republic then seeks to avenge, right? The Republic as a whole is a vengeance or revenge on two wrongs inflicted on Plato, right? Firstly, the execution of his beloved teacher Socrates, who was put to death by Democrats and sophists for his philosophical views and teachings. And a second vengeance that Plato is seeking here, the contempt and ignorance of the kings and politicians of his day, who choose power over justice and ignored wisdom for the sake of short-term gain. Right? Sounds, again, a little bit familiar with today's political problems. Right? To close, then, two takeaway questions. Has Plato really made a persuasive case for the ideal forms? Does reason really get us up there to see something that we can't see down here? And can we agree with his political implementation of them, the way he makes them work politically? Thank you for your patience, and enjoy the rest of your semester.